As I said earlier, this is JavaScript Fundamentals. This is your JavaScript 101 coming from somebody who knows something about programming, whether it be if you know what a function is and a variable is, and that'll get you most of the way you need to get to. This is actually a message from my daughter about the presentation. Hey, what do you want to tell my class? Her message is run away, scream, is essentially what the message is. Back to it, I'm a dad first, but I'm also a web developer. Been doing web development for about 5 years now. I'm self-taught, no college experience or anything. Not to say college isn't necessary. Go to college. It's awesome. Sure. I'm a fanboy. I do this stuff when I'm not at work. And I have a blog right there that I'm going to point you to probably a couple times before the day's over. MusicM122, which is my username for tons of stuff since I was like 12.blogspot.com. Why JavaScript, right? JavaScript's fundamentally one of the most misunderstood, but at the same time most popular languages. We'll talk about the history a little bit, a little language basics, some of the fundamental things you need to know about JavaScript, and that includes functions and objects. Structuring JavaScript basically, some of the more fundamental approaches to structuring your JavaScript. A lot of pitfalls and pain points, possibly some shiny things, what we're using out in the industry, and links of folks and actual websites and some books. And after that, get to the little bonus round. All right, why JavaScript? It's probably the most successful language that's done the write once, run anywhere. If anybody's ever heard that term, it was used for Java, it was used for C, it was used for, I think, just about every new language that come out there with some sort of middleware. It's highly expressive. Seriously, it can be. I know it's like that's really JavaScript. And because JavaScript fundamentally loves you and wants to be your friend. JavaScript is like that lonely kid in the playground that nobody had friends with. So I relate to him a lot. Maybe that's why I'm like rooting for him all the time. It's like the underdog. So JavaScript actually really tries to help you, and in a very clumsy and actually not very helpful way. And we'll get into some of that, but we won't get into everything because there's a lot of weird things that JavaScript does. All right, so some quotes by some micro celebrities, semi-famous people. If you've ever heard of Coding Horror, if you're a programmer, Jeff Atwood, he's a little famous, did put together Stack Overflow, he was the back-end tech guy. Scott Hanselman, if you're specific to Microsoft, and Microsoft is kind of a bad word around here, so Microsoft. He's the actual tech head at, I think he's an evangelist technically at, or something like that at Microsoft. He's a big ASP.NET supporter. And Douglas Crockford, which is essentially the guy that, it's almost as if it's like he brought back the Beatles. He made JavaScript not sound so absolutely horrible. And he fundamentally went, all right, there's a whole lot of bad things about JavaScript, but then there's this fundamental subset of good JavaScript. And granted, that's debatable in some circles, but it got everybody on the right track to move towards JavaScript as an actual usable language on its own. So, and I'll just mention his quote, deep down JavaScript has more in common with Lisp and Scheme than Java. So that's kind of a weird thing that not a lot of people realize. And again, we'll be getting more into it with the history. So there was this tiny little company called Mosaic that came up with something called Netscape Navigator. Anybody ever? So,
Full school.
Yeah, beginning of the web.
Netscape Composer.
That's right. Yeah. So, back before the second generation of the browser wars, the first generation was born at a place called Mosaic. They wrote they came up with the language JavaScript, and at the time, since Sun actually had the copyright, or they actually were bought by Sun, and at that time, Sun wanted a language that was compatible with to be compatible with the web and available or easily accessible to Java programmers. And Brendan actually wanted something that was more like Lisp and Scheme and all these other languages, so they actually kind of had a merry sort of marriage that in the course of 2 weeks conceived a child called JavaScript. Note some of the names they had for it: Mocha, LiveScript, MCA Script, JScript. Now, note that is all that Java has in common with JavaScript. A copyright name, a buzzword that, in order to get people to use JavaScript. There is nothing else in common between Java and JavaScript. Totally, that's it. So it's just a way to get people to use it. And that's pretty terrible sounding, I know. So currently it's owned by Oracle, kind of scary. Licensed out to Mozilla. So Mozilla is actually the janitor, the fundamental caretaker of JavaScript, and the ones, I guess, on the council of JavaScript, the EMCA council that, at least I think it's the EMCA council, that are trying to move JavaScript forward in the world. With that, let's get into some JavaScript. All right. So, before we go ahead, there's something called jQuery, which I'll demonstrate a little bit. I'm not going to get a lot into it, but demonstrate a little bit that is going to make your lives easier in terms of dealing with JavaScript. Let's go ahead and go to that slide. What we have here is a validation function, something that you as a JavaScript programmer extraordinaire would deal with a lot. And this is how you would do it without jQuery. No. All right, so without jQuery, and mind you, I will get into a lot of the details of this. Don't let this freak you out too much. We have this guy, window validate. Now, this is actually something that's scoped to the window, to the actual page that you're on. So this is a function that takes a test value and returns true or false using ternary. Bear with me a little bit on this one. We'll get into it later. So this funky bit document, get element by ID, you name your thing, value. This is, you have to do this all over the place to actually access anything that's in the actual HTML page at the top. And looking at the HTML page, we have this thing, this label thingy. Please input your name, a button, a text box. And looking at the actual HTML here, you see this thing called an onClick event. OnClick equals validate text field. This note, just showing you this. We'll show you the difference in a minute. Things to take note of. And I put a link in there to how to do the actual document.ready, which is what I'm going to show you in a minute, without it. So, with that, we've taken that in. We've taken fundamentally what is just JavaScript in. Let's take a look at it with jQuery. All right. So it's like, Terrence, what is this document.ready thing here? It's kind of weird, right? Well, that $sign is the beginning thing, the thing that indicates it's jQuery. That's a JavaScript library that helps you deal with the pain of managing what is called the DOM, the document object model, which is the abstraction for dealing with web pages, or HTML pages in particular. So this document.ready thing says, all right, once the page is finished loading, bind val button to click. And something fundamental as that can take about 30 lines in JavaScript. 30 lines. It's amazingly painful. And that's just for browser compliance. Again, the artifact of the browser wars, first generation of browser wars, second generation of browser wars, back in the day, 5 years, 3-4 years ago, like I'm old, we had to manually do that. And we'd have to actually do either browser checking, so it's like, is this Internet Explorer, or is this Firefox, or is this whatever? Or, well, this one works in Firefox, and this way works. I mean, it was absolutely horrid. It was awful. I hated JavaScript at the time. But things like this came about, and this was actually its own set of wars, the JavaScript library wars, that essentially brought forth things like this. You know, pain brings innovation, right? So that little piece, that little document.ready, promotes something called unobtrusive JavaScript, which is something I was mentioning a little bit earlier. So you can actually have a clean separation. Mind you, that's actually wrong. Let's take that out. That normally your HTML doesn't have JavaScript in it. Your JavaScript only has a minimal amount of referencing HTML. And of course, there is no CSS in your HTML. You know, there's separation here, which is what was asked earlier. In JavaScript, we have a couple of looping constructs. We have a for loop, pretty fundamental in most programming languages. For declare your iterator, declare your condition, increment your iterator, pretty standard. For in loops, which are actually something that you generally don't want to use on things that require any sort of ordering. For in loops are more often than not used with the concept called reflection. I don't know if anybody's ever, how many of you have heard of reflection before in terms of programming? Raising hands, sorry, I should probably say raising hands. Reflection. All right, so that's sort of like being able to look inside, let's say, the metadata of the code. You can find out code about code. So I can dynamically determine the properties of a particular object or value or something like that. And if you want to see that in action, click on it, give it a look.
The danger of that being that you add or delete the item, you change the collection, right? Is that
Depend, sort of. Well, the thing about, and I'm glad you brought that up. JavaScript, because it wants to be your friend, as I said earlier, will let you do a lot of things most other languages won't let you do. So you can actually loop through and look at your object or thing and take things out that fundamentally might need to be there. So that is, again, JavaScript, the lonely kid that lets you do whatever you want. So, so there is a little bit of concern there. But, so again, for in loops, reflection, or iterating through members of a particular object. When I say members, I mean anything that lives in that object. Other than that, pretty standard stuff. While loops are while loops. For loops are for loops. Do while are do while. I almost never use a do while. So, all right. So we're going to get into objects. All right. So essentially, objects are a little bit different from what you're used to in other languages. First bit is 3 different ways we can create an object. Note that middle one is actually a little bit newer, may not work in all the browsers. Browser war issue. But for the most part, objects are just name-value pairs. Is anybody familiar with the term dictionary or hash? Let's show of hands. Anybody knows what a dictionary or hash is? In hands? Anybody? Okay. Raise your hand too. All right. So, well, for those of you who don't know, Dayton, I know you know. Raise your hand too. There you go. All right. Essentially, you provide a name and you get back a value. So, in this case, a dictionary would be a list of objects that are associated with a list of keys. So, you provide the key, you get the value, and that's the gist of it. In this case, JavaScript objects are a lot like that. So, in this case, and the third bit the same way. It actually means the same thing. So that second notation might actually make it simpler for you to tell the difference there. So are we good on? We're good on objects and dynamic collection of properties. Okay. All right. That leads us to our next fun thing in JavaScript land, JSON. And if anybody's ever dealt with passing data, XML, passing, I guess, binary data, passing data along, it's not, when you're dealing with the web, is a lot more efficient than a lot of other methods because it's simply JavaScript. It's a subset of JavaScript. It's just, in this case, and in this example, I have a comparison to between XML and JSON. You know, we have a menu, say element would be the right word, and values with the element. I mean, if you want a subset of something, you have a extra layer. Essentially, this is a combination of JavaScript objects and JavaScript arrays. There are a couple of caveats. There's obviously you can't use a function. When I say obviously, that's not right. You can't use a function in JSON because you're passing data. You're not passing actual objects here. But you're essentially, you can use your JavaScript fundamental objects, or say primitive objects, and you can pass other JSON objects. So, and you can pass null. Hey. All right. Another thing about objects, generally speaking, you're passing by value, and again, click on the link here. Objects are copied when passed in. The only time that's not true is when dealing with complex objects, like user-defined objects. Those are actually passed via reference. So I pass you a complex object, I can modify it, and it will actually maintain that state. So that piece of memory is still there, the same. You're modifying the same piece of memory. So it's a little bit tricky. This is actually a simplified example using something called object.create, which is available to newer subsets of JavaScript. So your browser may or may not support it. But this is a way to deal with inheritance without having to deal with prototyping, which is something we're going to get more into later. But essentially, you create your default object, at which point you can apply an option to your default object and actually add to that default object and reference another version of the default object. Again, object create is 1,000 times simpler. If you can use it, use it. If not, good luck. There's also extensions. And JavaScript being really passive by nature allows you to do a lot of things you otherwise wouldn't be able to do in other languages. Extensions in JavaScript are pretty easy compared to other things, compared to other languages, excuse me. So if I have a type, in this case a string, in order to extend the string, all I need to do is add the word prototype, or .prototype to access the string's prototype property, or member, really, and add something to it. So trim never existed in JavaScript by default. There are newer, again, they're getting there with it, but it's not there. This is all you would have to do to add trim. And I just did a regular expression that replaces this. I got that from this guy's site. He clocked different versions, did speed tests and the different things. But essentially, I can just add anything to anything I want. And that's some of the good and bad in JavaScript. Generally speaking, you want to stay away from system types. But in a case to where the thing works the same way in most implementations. Like if I'm doing trim, I'm going to get a string that takes away spaces. That's kind of a given in most languages. So there is, use with care, use with a little bit of caution. Your implementation expectations might be different from somebody else's. It is here, functions. All right, 3 ways to declare functions in JavaScript. We have your function literal, you have your function literal, you have your function constructor, and then you have your function or your object that object container that refers to a function. So pretty straightforward so far, I hope. Note this first way right here, the actual when you're declaring a function, then the name of function, that automatically gets sent to the or declared in the global namespace. Or global namespace, but global scope. So anything and everything in your page can access it. So I'd say minimize the amount of that if you can. But disclaimer: function literals, which is actually the preferred way of declaring functions. I'd say if there's a go-to to actually declare a function, you generally want to go with the literal first. Anything else, you probably want to hold off on. The new constructor bit, that is another thing. This is actually dealing with prototypes and what I'm actually going to get into next. Now the new is kind of a mind-bendy thing. So new in JavaScript works a little different from new in other languages and has a couple caveats. When you do a new object, let's pop it open. When you do a new object in JavaScript, essentially makes a, well, first off, note that the new thing that which you're instantiating has to be a function in order for this to work properly. But other than that, it actually creates a copy, or it creates an object and then copies a reference to the new object that actually has the properties of the original object. So that might be kind of a mind-bending thing. But Is that clear to everybody? Is everybody okay with that?
So it gives you the ability to say, you pretty much make copies is what you're saying.
Yeah, well, it makes a reference to the, I guess, the structure of the original object and stores the data locally, but yeah. So
then you have two independent, the same original object, you have two independent versions of it.
that's right.
Okay.
Okay. Clear as mud? All right. So this example allows you to see the difference between the original object and a new instance of the object. And I'll take this time to point out the console in JavaScript. All right, so console actually printed out the insides of my object. So my instance actually creates a new object. My prototype is undefined, and prototype is actually something that's every single thing, be it a function and or object in JavaScript has. And that's actually what gets referenced whenever you're making a new object. If you make a copy of an existing object type, that's the first thing, that's actually what gets looked at. And it actually goes and up what's called the prototype chain. So if you have an object that inherits from another object, inherits from another object, it looks at that prototype, it looks at that thing's prototype, it looks at that thing's prototype. So prototype essentially is a blueprint of that particular object. And if that blueprint has another object inside it, et cetera, et cetera. So the thing about JavaScript is, or at least from my experience as a person coding JavaScript, you minimize the amount of complex object hierarchies. It makes your life a lot easier. You can use inheritance, but again, it almost forces you to be simple because there is no built-in global, I guess, util that manages dependencies. So you can code yourself into a lot of trouble if you're not careful. I'll go over some workarounds for this, but namely require.js and the future of JavaScript. But for the most part, you'd stay low on the amount of inheritance you deal with in here. JavaScript prefers a first composition over inheritance for the most part. So object A has an object B versus object A is an object B, if that makes sense. All right, it's back on track. All right. So, how many people know about recursion? Raise your hand. All right. For the rest of you, let's talk a little bit about it. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about an example of recursion that isn't really mind-melting, but the classic ones still hold true. So in order to understand recursion, one must first understand recursion. That statement is recursive in nature. So it's self-calling, I guess would be the best way to put it. Sort of like an endless sort of loop. So lather, rinse, repeat, 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 lather, rinse, repeat. That would be recursive. That would be a recursive statement. A statement that at the end refers to the beginning, tells you to go back to the beginning and do it again. And beginning again, and beginning again, and beginning again, and beginning again. Until you decide to stop. For one reason or another.
Repeat and repeat, we're on a boat.
What's that?
Repeat and repeat, we're on a boat. Pete stepped out to his left. Repeat and repeat, we're on a boat.
Awesome. I didn't know that one. I gotta write that down. And if that's still kind of mind-bending to you, there's a story example. It's not really so much a coding thing, but it's more of an English example. And there was a military cadence, I think I remember, the frog in the log, the bog in the middle of the sea or something like that. So, awesome, cut me off. So a child couldn't sleep, so a mother told a story about a little frog who couldn't sleep, so the frog told a story about a little bear who couldn't sleep, so it told a story about a little weasel, etc., 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 etc. And eventually once you go through all the iterations, or the inner iterations actually kind of folds out. So once you get to the end, who fell asleep, the thing that fell asleep, and then it kind of comes out. So the bear fell asleep, and the frog fell asleep, and the child fell asleep, and it kind of works its way out. So Recursion is one of those things, the more you work with it, the more it makes sense, and the funner it becomes. Love me some recursion. All right. And with that, we have an actual code example of recursion, and it's the classic one, the Fibonacci sequence. Now, the Fibonacci sequence is a mathematical sequence that, for one, is generally used to explain recursion, but otherwise is used to explain Leonardo's golden ratio. Going off topic a little bit here, but there was believed to be a perfect equation for, or there was an equation technique for beauty, a ratio for perfect beauty, for balance or equality, and that was something that folks like Pythagoras back in the day obsessed over. So they came up with this Fibonacci sequence to describe the perfect way to actually separate things or split things in half, don't they? So that's ad-libbing it a little bit, but yeah. So essentially, this little line will print out the entire Fibonacci sequence up to the number that you specify. So I have one more example. It's like, yo dog, heard you like functions, so I put a function in your function so you can call what you apply. It's a meme on the internet, exhibit. It's actually a recursive meme. So you can x, y, u, x, y, u, x, y, or you can x, y, u, x, so you y, so you can y, y, u, y, is the structure. So hopefully that gets you thinking recursively.
Can I ask a person who doesn't code question?
Okay.
The reason for the recursion statements, is that just to make the code more efficient?
It's yes.
So that you're doing you're following 6 streams at once with only 1 or 2 lines of code?
Absolutely. Essentially cleaner code, which is what you, which is one of the pinnacles of what you want to do as a programmer. You want clean and readable code. You want self-evident code. And recursion is an awesome way to minimize the amount of cruft that you have in your program. So yes, aside from readability, expressiveness can be beat. Functions in JavaScript can be used as arguments, can be returned as values, can be assigned to variables, can be stored in data structures, can be nested, and et cetera, you can read. So with all these things, generally speaking, if you have that in the language, that is almost the recipe for a first-class citizen as a function, or a function as a first-class citizen. Functions can be done with as objects can be done with. So with that,
I have another
sure. What's up?
non-coder question. When it says can be anonymous, is that is it like you're hiding from view of another program knowing what you're asking, or what does anonymous mean in this context?
Awesome. Thank you for that. So going back to, and I'll show you. So going back to your 3 ways to declare, that second function, the function literal, this guy, the function with the parameters, he would, this function would effectively be anonymous on its own, and it's applied to this guy. So before it's set to add, it's anonymous. It's a function that has no direct way of referencing it. And with JavaScript, you can do this all day with tons of different things. But essentially, it's a function without a name in this case. Is that clear?
It's a function without a name. But okay, I guess if I was
Is that like a horse with a name?
Yes, it's like a horse without a name.
Maybe a better way of describing it would be saying you could use it where you write it at, but you can't use it later. You can't call that same function name because there's no name.
All right, that sounds good. So
you can't reference back to it. It's
you can't call it again without writing
right
it.
at the
right.
point of something. Okay.
Right.
Kinda like,
Without having a point.
I know everything I know. You don't know what I know. Those are my functions.
So I could use it. Could I use it anonymous in a recursive statement? Then?
Absolutely, and they're often used in recursive statements.
Oh,
as mentioned,
okay.
right? So actually, going back to that function as first-class citizen, you can pass a function. You can pass an anonymous function to a function, and have that anonymous function run however many different things recursively, and
Okay.
nothing else would know about it. and I'll show you a little
No,
bit.
is that how, and maybe I'm jumping ahead, is that how like a virus would work? It's anonymous, you can't really see it right away?
Not necessarily. It's more of a programming convention. So
Okay.
I mean, you could write a function that's anonymous that can be used in a virus, I guess, but it isn't necessarily synonymous with virus.
Okay.
If that clears up.
That's okay, and it would take a very long time for me to understand everything about it.
Okay.
I just wanted to get a little clarity, that's all.
And that's actually what we were just talking about, functions inside functions. So we can have a function that, well, some of what we're talking about. We can have functions that are declared inside functions that are declared inside functions, so we can get recursive from that. But essentially, in this case, we have a foo and a bar. Now foo encloses the function bar. So the lifetime of bar only is within the scope, or the lifetime of the foo function. So bar only exists inside foo. Nobody else knows about bar, nobody cares about bar. Bar is instantiated inside foo and disappears when foo goes out of scope. There's good things and bad things about closures that you might want to worry about, and I'll talk about that some more later. But essentially your function declarations, good things. You can access anything inside foo from bar. Bar knows about everything in foo. And that's actually how we get into our classes in JavaScript. We use functions for classes, but that is the fundamental concept that once you get is like 90% of JavaScript that you have to really worry about. Functions inside of functions, scoping within functions, inside functions, etc., etc., etc. So, is that clear as mud? All right.
So what name would you use, foo? You call foo, or would you call bar?
Well, in this case, I declare this function foo, and if I want to use it, I just use foo. I don't need to know about bar. It's information hiding to a certain extent. In this case, you can still see bar if you're even if you're not looking at the code directly, you can still access bar. And I'll show you some ways to actually have information hiding in your program that allows you to hide it completely so you don't see it. But for the most part, you would just call foo and you would just worry about foo. And this brings us to a simple class. And I use the word class tongue-in-cheek somewhat because JavaScript doesn't really have a concept of classes, which is, I guess, kind of weird sounding. A programming language without a class? What do you mean? Well, functions do a lot of the legwork. Enclosures are a lot of the legwork that simulate classes. So in this case, we have a car, right? So it's a function that takes a model as an argument. And this guy just about does everything the class would necessarily need to do. So you can new it up, because it's a function. You new it up, it makes a copy, and it has these properties on it. So your model, color, and your act is the properties on the function, so you can access those. And your getInfo acts as a method call on the function. So effectively, it's a class. It's like duck typing. It looks like a duck, it quacks like a duck. It's just about a duck. So is that clear for everybody? What's up?
Okay, I was going to say, I'm going to ask a question I meant to ask a while back.
Sure.
I noticed that the screen is 4 panes, right?
Yep.
And previously you had something in every one. I said, oh, okay, well, you need a little HTML there, and then behind the scenes you're running your JavaScript. I didn't know what CSS meant, and then the result pane told you what you should ultimately see on your window pane or whatever. So, in this case, you're writing JavaScript. Is that because you don't necessarily need HTML, or you're just doing the JavaScript first and then you'll work in the HTML later?
I don't necessarily need that first one's true. I don't need the HTML and or the CSS in this case.
And what does CSS stand for?
Cascading style sheets.
Oh, yeah.
It's the way to visually modify your HTML without touching your HTML. Set the colors, and you can get font sizes and font types. It's like typefacing, if you were talking about something that's I guess a concrete real life equivalent. So like I guess your graphic designers and things would work a lot in that space. Private members in it. For those of you who work with public and private members in class. So this is what's called the revealing module pattern. Among the other practitioners, there was one Christian Heimelman, who was at POSCON, cool guy, who actually came up with this one. So with the revealing module pattern, you still have your function. Everything that lives or is scoped within this var is actually private. And in order to actually get back things that you want to access later, you return the stuff that scoped stuff scoped within this object right here. This is actually what you get back. So with this, you can actually do functions as well. Anything private. I kept the example fairly simple to not have to deal with a whole lot here, but essentially, yeah, this is your private stuff on lines 10 through 12. And your public stuff is lines 13 through 17, essentially. You create your instance, just like normal. Pretty straightforward, once you understand the concept, right?
Is it kind of like getters and setters? Is that all this is trying to do?
Yes, that's right. Getters and setters, exactly.
Have a public function.
Absolutely. Getters and setters, public and private properties. All right. So from there, I'm just going to point you to some more of the complex design patterns. There's a book by this guy, Adi Osamani, that actually goes over tons and tons and tons of design patterns, totally free. It's link in the page. We start with the simple patterns and we go to patterns even specific to jQuery. This guy's pretty elite. This guy made a JavaScript MVC framework. The actual name of the framework is JavaScript MVC. Clearly not that creative a guy apparently, but hey, smart guy. So that's in your notes. So basic pattern. And now we get to some of the fun pitfalls. All right, so as I said before, globally scoped by default. So what does that mean? Everything lives in the window of the page. So I declare something by default, goes to the window. That's one thing that's, again, caused a lot of developers to cringe at the thought of even using JavaScript for anything important. Again, the second one kind of goes with the first one, no concept of namespaces. Require.js absolves you of some of that. I'll show you guys a little bit about Require.js. And the search for truthiness. This is a fun one. JavaScript actually, as part of being your friend, attempts to actually, when compares something, attempts to convert the types for you. And it tries to drop it down, in both cases, to numbers by default. But often, it doesn't do a very good job of it. Actually, I have this is actually some of this fun stuff on the page. Long story short, don't trust JavaScript's attempts to actually compare stuff for you. Use the 3 equal signs in JavaScript as opposed to the 2. That's long story short. There's folks that just go nuts over this stuff, but I'm not going to kill you with every single potential case. But long story short, converts everything to nums and does a very bad job of it. Don't use the 2 equals, use the 3 equals. All right, variable hoisting. That is another awesome thing about JavaScript. And note that it's actually on the webpage. If you're scoping a var within something that already has a var, it redimensions it and destroys every single version of it. So if I have a foo that I've referenced outside the global scope and I have a foo that I define in the function scope, simply because they're named the same thing, it will point to the actual original foo, destroy the context of it because it goes out of scope inside the function. So you undefine your function, or you undefine your variable. So long story short, use a single var style, and single vars are essentially looks something. Yeah. I actually have it in code too. So. All right. Going back to this. This is single variable style. You have one var statement, and then essentially you declare your variable, set it equal to something, comma, set something else, declare your variable, assign it, declare your variable, assign it, or just declare your variable, whatever. But the key thing is one var. Var indicates this is a new thing, I'm redimensioning the scope, or I'm re-declaring this thing, and the scope is set to whatever the parent function is. So that is called variable hoisting that you have to worry about. Essentially, just don't declare variables outside of, obviously don't use the same variable name, but you can't help but not use that. Declare your variables at the beginning of your functions, limit the amount of redeclarations you do in general, or just don't do them. You can pass your values in, pass copies, but using that and using something called strict mode, which forces you to declare your variables at the beginning of functions as well, and catches you for a lot of other issues when it comes down to scoping. This scoping was something that a couple of folks brought up. This in JavaScript is a little different from this in other languages. This is actually the execution context of the function, and this guy actually talks a good bit about it. Essentially, this refers to the calling function, and let's repeat that again. This refers to the calling function. So if I call a function, I use this in the function, I'm pointing to the function. If I call a function in a function, it refers to the function, or the refer. If I call function B in function A, function B will get to this. It's whatever the calling function is. So that can be a pain point, and that's something that that you have to be careful of in JavaScript. There's no easy way to fix this scoping, except for simply not using this very much and actually passing by value everywhere, which is one way of dealing with it. There's another way. You can simply point at the beginning of a function this to another variable. That way you have a copy of it somewhere. But essentially, there is no quick and easy way to just not deal with it, except for not using this or pointing this to something else, to that. You often see. So Ajax, another thing that's a whole other can of worms right there. Raw Ajax, and you get a fun look at raw Ajax. So an Ajax request looks about like this, or used to look about like this, or on the inside looks about like this. You got one for each. Well, this one deals with anything active object related, obviously, which indicates the Microsoft piece. And if not that, there's also ones for, this one doesn't actually have it, one for each browser that you're dealing with. Writing these by hand was painful. I'm not saying don't learn about them. Learning about doing Ajax requests by hand, it's good to know. But do yourself a favor, use a framework or use another tool like jQuery, or among the list of other libraries that have this stuff built in.
Why reinvent the wheel?
Absolutely. Not to say that it's not good to know. It's good to know about it, but learn from the mistakes of others. Stand on the shoulders of giants. Don't handcraft your Ajax requests. And I guess for those of you who don't know what Ajax is, I probably should start with that. Asynchronous JavaScript and XML. It's a way of calling JavaScript from other pages, calling code from other pages, or pulling data from other pages within a page. Again, I'm not getting too much into it. It's a topic in itself. It's awesome, but it's a little scary too, I guess. If you're not, once you get versed in JavaScript, it's actually pretty easy. Okay, so more pitfalls. Arrays. Arrays in JavaScript are not like arrays in other languages. They're actually referred to as fake arrays in JavaScript a lot of times. Because arrays are essentially objects with a property that contains an index. So why is this different? In memory, they're located in different places. There's no, if you're from a C or C++ background, you know arrays are chunks of memory. This is not true in JavaScript. Arrays are just objects. And they are not as efficient as one would hope. Put it this way, I've put it to the test in a lot of places. We've actually generated tons of JavaScript versus other languages, and it will break your page. It will slow you down to a crawl. And as far as memory consumption usage, it leaks pretty tough. So minimize the amount of multi-dimensional and jagged arrays, if you're familiar with that. We've discussed new, and new can be kind of confusing if you're not careful with it, so use new with care. Prototypes, again, didn't touch too much on prototypes because prototypes are something you don't use with kid gloves, but we know that prototypes are the objects within the objects. Whenever you're dealing with a type, eval is, I think, in the 90s, one of the most overused pain points in JavaScript. A lot of your cross-site scripting hacks come from eval. Eval essentially is a function that says whatever string I get in the parameter, do that. So a lot of people have done lots of awful things with eval. Just simply don't use it. It's bad for you. Eval is bad for you. JavaScript, again, being your friend and loving you so much, has something called automatic semicolon insertion. So if you're missing your semicolon, JavaScript will try to put it in there for you. And there are cases to where you don't want it to, which is why, if you note the style of most all JavaScript, you have the, I guess it'd be the closest to one true bracing style, sort of K&R bracing style, if you're talking bracing styles, where the brace of a function is on the same line, or the brace of a thing is on the same line. That's done deliberately because JavaScript will attempt to put a semicolon in places because it thinks that you missed the semicolon. Being awesome as that is, it blew my mind. It's like, really? So there is literally one style to use in JavaScript. All right. So Doom incompatibility. And this, again, goes back to the browser wars, IE6, IE7, IE8, IE9, Chrome versus WebKit on Apple's thing. Wow, I can't even think of the word now. Safari, that one. All over the place. Tons of incompatibility issues. Simply put, use jQuery, but I don't want to just say don't learn the actual the incompatibility issues. But if you want to save yourself some pain, use a framework like jQuery, a library like jQuery, to actually deal with the DOM yourself. Again, I wasn't going to talk too much about it. Just point you there. This is more about structure of JavaScript itself. So, to start with, additional resources, Stack Overflow. Favorite place ever, I love Stack Overflow. A couple of free books on here. Eloquent JavaScript, the essential JavaScript patterns I showed you earlier. Not so free, but still awesome. Douglas Crockford's JavaScript: The Good Parts. Secrets of the JavaScript Ninja, written by the author of jQuery. JavaScript Patterns is actually the book I have right here that you can win in a minute, and I'll show you. So these are folks you really want to care about in JavaScript. Not a full list of folks, but some folks you want to look at or follow on Twitter to get the latest and greatest on like the good, the bad, the ugly JavaScript stuff. So we're on the bonus round. If you choose to, you can compete in this little competition. Excuse me. So what this is JavaScript cones. JavaScript cones are like if you haven't heard of the concept of cone is a method of practice to actually get you good to know something, I guess, would be the best way to put it. I'd say if you're new to the language and you really want to touch on everything, just to see what you remember from this presentation or what you know in general, I'd say go ahead and open up a terminal and run that line right there that I have there, the git clone. Open up Cone Runner and have fun. So the furthest along gets a book, and we'll go from now till I guess 11:30, 11:45, and in that time we can get individual questions answered in the meantime, and I can work with individual folks on whatever problems they may have, et cetera, et cetera. So have fun with that, and if anybody's got any questions for me that they don't want to ask in a public setting, or they want to work with stuff on their own, or just anything, now would be the time to talk to me.
Oddly enough, I actually enjoy the cones the best. I like puzzles, so I found the certainly use some of the references, so that'd be nice. I appreciate it all.
All right, thank you. Would you like to say anything about the lecture?
It was a really good lecture, one of the better lectures I've attended since I've been here, and looking forward to the next one.
Thank you.
I want to thank Terrence for doing this today. He did a great job. Learned some new things on JavaScript that I'd lost touch with.
Thank you.
Guys, I'll just say that.
Would you like to say anything about the lecture?
Great class. Enjoyed it.
Very good.
It's going to be on the blog.
What did you say?
It's very good.
Is there anything you'd like to say about the lecture?
I had a great time. Thank you.
Do you want to say anything?
You're doing good, even for a simple-minded person like me. All right, so yeah, take it.
Any comments?
Good class.
Yeah, I mean,
He did a great job.
Great job.
This is true. He's a pretty smart guy.
You're not just saying extra work.
I should give him an award or something.
Right.
Would you like to say anything about the lecture?
Class is very interesting. I learned a lot.
1, 2, 3.
All right, thank you.